the new God of victory, the new gods of victory, the new God of victory, the new goddess of victory, the new goddesses of victory, the new goddess of victory, the old God of victory, the old gods of victory, the old God of victory, the old goddess of victory, the old goddesses of victory, the old goddess of victory, the greater God of victory, the greater gods of victory, the greater God of victory, the greater goddess of victory, the greater goddesses of victory, the greater goddess of victory, the lesser God of victory, the lesser gods of victory, the lesser God of victory, the lesser goddess of victory, the lesser goddesses of victory, the lesser goddess of victory, the higher God of victory, the higher gods of victory, the higher God of victory, the higher goddess of victory, the higher goddesses of victory, the higher goddess of victory, the lower God of victory, the lower gods of victory, the lower God of victory, the lower goddess of victory, the lower goddesses of victory, the lower goddess of victory, the greater spirit of victory, the greater spirits of victory, the greater spirit of victory, the lesser spirit of victory, the lesser spirits of victory, the lesser spirit of victory, the higher spirit of victory, the higher spirits of victory, the higher spirit of victory, the lower spirit of victory, the lower spirits of victory, the lower spirit of victory, the major God of victory, the major gods of victory, the major God of victory, the major goddess of victory, the major goddesses of victory, the major goddess of victory, the minor God of victory, the minor gods of victory, the minor God of victory, the minor goddess of victory, the minor goddesses of victory, the minor goddess of victory, the superior God of victory, the superior gods of victory, the superior God of victory, the superior goddess of victory, the superior goddesses of victory, the superior goddess of victory, the inferior God of victory, the inferior gods of victory, the inferior God of victory, the inferior goddess of victory, the inferior goddesses of victory, the inferior goddess of victory, the ancestor God of victory, the ancestor gods of victory, the ancestor God of victory, the ancestor goddess of victory, the ancestor goddesses of victory, the ancestor goddess of victory, the ascendant God of victory, the ascendant gods of victory, the ascendant God of victory, the ascendant goddess of victory, the ascendant goddesses of victory, the ascendant goddess of victory, the descendant God of victory, the descendant gods of victory, the descendant God of victory, the descendant goddess of victory, the descendant goddesses of victory, the descendant goddess of victory, the transcendent God of victory, the transcendent gods of victory, the transcendent God of victory, the transcendent goddess of victory, the transcendent goddesses of victory, the transcendent goddess of victory, the past God of victory, the past gods of victory, the past God of victory, the past goddess of victory, the past goddesses of victory, the past goddess of victory, the present God of victory, the present gods of victory, the present God of victory, the present goddess of victory, the present goddesses of victory, the present goddess of victory, the future God of victory, the future gods of victory, the future God of victory, the future goddess of victory, the future goddesses of victory, the future goddess of victory, the authentic God of victory, the authentic gods of victory, the authentic God of victory, the authentic goddess of victory, the authentic goddesses of victory, the authentic goddess of victory, the synthetic God of victory, the synthetic gods of victory, the synthetic God of victory, the synthetic goddess of victory, the synthetic goddesses of victory, the synthetic goddess of victory, the progressive God of victory, the progressive gods of victory, the progressive God of victory, the progressive goddess of victory, the progressive goddesses of victory, the progressive goddess of victory, the regressive God of victory, the regressive gods of victory, the regressive God of victory, the regressive goddess of victory, The regressive goddesses of victory. The regressive goddess of victory. The ordinary god of victory. The ordinary gods of victory. The ordinary god of victory. The ordinary goddess of victory. The ordinary goddesses of victory. The ordinary goddess of victory. The extraordinary god of victory. The extraordinary gods of victory. The extraordinary god of victory. The extraordinary goddess of victory. The extraordinary goddesses of victory. The extraordinary goddess of victory. The static god of victory. The static gods of victory. The static god of victory. The static goddess of victory. The static goddesses of victory. The static goddess of victory. The dynamic god of victory. The dynamic gods of victory. The dynamic god of victory. The dynamic goddess of victory. The dynamic goddesses of victory. The dynamic goddess of victory. The land god of victory. The land gods of victory. The land god of victory. The land goddess of victory. The land goddesses of victory. The land goddess of victory. The sea god of victory. The sea gods of victory. The sea god of victory. The sea goddess of victory. The sea goddesses of victory. The sea goddess of victory. The sky god of victory. The sky gods of victory. The sky god of victory. The sky goddess of victory. The sky goddesses of victory. The sky goddess of victory. The god of victory. The gods of victory. The god of victory. The goddess of victory. The goddesses of victory. The goddess of victory. The half god of victory. The half gods of victory. The half god of victory. The half goddess of victory. The half goddesses of victory. The half goddess of victory. The vessel of victory. The vessels of victory. The vessel of victory. The name of victory. The names of victory. The name of victory. The person of victory. The persons of victory. The person of victory. The persona of victory. The personas of victory. The persona of victory. The personage of victory. The personages of victory. The personage of victory. The personality of victory. The personalities of victory. The personality of victory. The personification of victory. The personifications of victory. The personification of victory. The image of victory. The images of victory. The image of victory. The imagination of victory. The imaginations of victory. The imagination of victory. The belief of victory. The beliefs of victory. The belief of victory. The thought of victory. The thoughts of victory. The thought of victory. The word of victory. The words of victory. The word of victory. The action of victory. The actions of victory. The action of victory. The reaction of victory. The reactions of victory. The reaction of victory. The feeling of victory. The feelings of victory. The feeling of victory. The situation of victory. The situations of victory. The situation of victory. The circumstance of victory. The circumstances of victory. The circumstance of victory. The environment of victory. The environments of victory. The environment of victory. The relationship of victory. The relationships of victory. The relationship of victory. The number of victory. The numbers of victory. The number of victory. The formula of victory. The formulas of victory. The formula of victory. The equation of victory. The equations of victory. The equation of victory. The theory of victory. The theories of victory. The theory of victory. The symbol of victory. The symbols of victory. The symbol of victory. The color of victory. The colors of victory. The color of victory. The thing of victory. The things of victory. The thing of victory. The way of victory. The ways of victory. The way of victory. The place of victory. The places of victory. The place of victory. The time of victory. The times of victory. The time of victory. The event of victory. The events of victory. The event of victory. The result of victory. The results of victory. The result of victory. The crown of victory. The crowns of victory. The crown of victory. The throne of victory. The thrones of victory. the throne of victory, the victory king, the victory kings, the victory kingdom, the victory kingdoms, the victory king's subject, the victory king's subjects, the victory king's dominion, the victory king's dominions, the kingdom of victory, the kingdoms of victory, the kingdom of victory, the victory queen, the victory queens, the victory queendom, the victory queendoms, the victory queen subject, the victory queen subjects, the victory queen's dominion, the victory queen's dominions, the queendom of victory, the queendoms of victory, the queendom of victory, the victory prince, the victory princes, the victory princedom, the victory princedoms, the victory prince's subject, the victory prince's subjects, the victory prince's dominion, the victory prince's dominions, the princedom of victory, the princedoms of victory, the princedom of victory, the victory princess, the victory princesses, the victory princessdom, the victory princessdoms, the victory princess's subject, the victory princess's subjects, the victory princess's dominion, the victory princess's dominions, the princessdom of victory, the princessdoms of victory, the princessdom of victory, the lord of victory, the lords of victory, the lord of victory, the lordess of victory, the lordesses of victory, the lordess of victory, the priest of victory, the priests of victory, the priest of victory, the priestess of victory, the priestesses of victory, the priestess of victory, the ritual of victory, the rituals of victory, the ritual of victory, the shrine of victory, the shrines of victory, the shrine of victory, the temple of victory, the temples of victory, the temple of victory, the leader of victory, the leaders of victory, the leader of victory, the follower of victory, the followers of victory, the follower of victory, the natural substance of victory, the natural substances of victory, the natural substance of victory, the supernatural substance of victory, the supernatural substances of victory, the supernatural substance of victory, the temporal substance of victory, the temporal substances of victory, the temporal substance of victory, the spiritual substance of victory, the spiritual substances of victory, the spiritual substance of victory, the natural form of victory, the natural forms of victory, the natural form of victory, the supernatural form of victory, the supernatural forms of victory, the supernatural form of victory, the temporal form of victory, the temporal forms of victory, the temporal form of victory, the spiritual form of victory, the spiritual forms of victory, the spiritual form of victory, the age of victory, the ages of victory, the age of victory, the era of victory, the eras of victory, the era of victory, the awakener of victory, the awakeners of victory, the awakener of victory, the awakening of victory, the awakenings of victory, the awakening of victory, the realm of victory, the realms of victory, the realm of victory, the dimension of victory, the dimensions of victory, the dimension of victory, the zone of victory, the zones of victory, the zone of victory, the frequency of victory, the frequencies of victory, the frequency of victory, the century of victory, the centuries of victory, the century of victory, the millennium of victory, the millenniums of victory, the millennium of victory, the purpose of victory, the purposes of victory, the purpose of victory, the meaning of victory, the meanings of victory, the meaning of victory, the culture of victory, the cultures of victory, the culture of victory, the demonstrator of victory, the demonstrators of victory, the demonstrator of victory, the demonstration of victory, the demonstrations of victory, the demonstration of victory, the manifester of victory, the manifestors of victory, the manifester of victory, the manifestation of victory, the manifestations of victory, the manifestation of victory, the presence of victory, the presences of victory, the presence of victory, the glow of victory, the glows of victory, the glow of victory, the goal of victory, the goals of victory, the goal of victory, the plan of victory, the plans of victory, the plan of victory, the book of victory, the books of victory, the book of victory, the philosopher of victory, the philosophers of victory, the philosopher of victory, the philosophy of victory, the philosophies of victory, the philosophy of victory, the releaser of victory, the releasers of victory, the releaser of victory, the release of victory, the releases of victory, the release of victory, the variable of victory, the variables of victory, the variable of victory, the cause of victory, the causes of victory, the cause of victory, the effect of victory, the effects of victory, the effect of victory, the journey of victory, the journeys of victory, the journey of victory, the emergence of victory, the emergences of victory, the emergence of victory, the source of victory, the sources of victory, the source of victory, the originator of victory, the originators of victory, the originator of victory, the origin of victory, the origins of victory, the origin of victory, the forefather of victory, the forefathers of victory, the forefather of victory, the foremother of victory, the foremothers of victory, the foremother of victory, the ancestor of victory, the ancestors of victory, the ancestor of victory, the descendant of victory, the descendants of victory, the descendant of victory, the lineage of victory, the lineages of victory, the lineage of victory, the heritage of victory, the heritages of victory, the heritage of victory, the heir of victory, the heirs of victory, the heir of victory, the co-heir of victory, the co-heirs of victory, the co-heir of victory, the joint heir of victory, the joint heirs of victory, the joint heir of victory, the dynasty of victory, the dynasties of victory, the dynasty of victory, the force of victory, the forces of victory, the force of victory, the law of victory, the laws of victory, the law of victory, the pact of victory, the pacts of victory, the pact of victory, the game of victory, the games of victory, the game of victory, the mask of victory, the masks of victory, the mask of victory, the armor of victory, the armors of victory, the armor of victory, the sword of victory, the swords of victory, the sword of victory, the shield of victory, the shields of victory, the shield of victory, the force shield of victory, the force shields of victory, the force shield of victory, the armored force shield of victory, the armored force shields of victory, the armored force shield of victory, the champion of victory, the champions of victory, the champion of victory, the guardian of victory, the guardians of victory, the guardian of victory, the defender of victory, the defenders of victory, the defender of victory, the protector of victory, the protectors of victory, the protector of victory, the chant of victory, the chants of victory, the chant of victory, the shape of victory, the shapes of victory, the shape of victory, the cube of victory, the cubes of victory, the cube of victory, the cuboid of victory, the cuboids of victory, the cuboid of victory, the sphere of victory, the spheres of victory, the sphere of victory, the spheroid of victory, the spheroids of victory, the spheroid of victory, the prism of victory, the prisms of victory, the prism of victory, the pyramid of victory, the pyramids of victory, the pyramid of victory, the cylinder of victory, the cylinders of victory, the cylinder of victory, the cone of victory, the cones of victory, the cone of victory, the triangle of victory, the triangles of victory, the triangle of victory, the circle of victory, the circles of victory, the circle of victory, the semicircle of victory, the semicircles of victory, the semicircle of victory, the square of victory, the squares of victory, the square of victory, the rectangle of victory, the rectangles of victory, the rectangle of victory, the parallelogram of victory, The parallelograms of victory. The parallelogram of victory. The rhombus of victory. The rhombuses of victory. The rhombus of victory. The trapezoid of victory. The trapezoids of victory. The trapezoid of victory. The polygon of victory. The polygons of victory. The polygon of victory. The pentagon of victory. The pentagons of victory. The pentagon of victory. The hexagon of victory. The hexagons of victory. The hexagon of victory. The septagon of victory. The septagons of victory. The septagon of victory. The octagon of victory. The octagons of victory. The octagon of victory. The nonagon of victory. The nonagons of victory. The nonagon of victory. The decagon of victory. The decagons of victory. The decagon of victory. The evolution of victory. The evolutions of victory. The evolution of victory. The revolution of victory. The revolutions of victory. The revolution of victory. The elemental art of victory. The elemental arts of victory. The elemental art of victory. The elemental science of victory. The elemental sciences of victory. The elemental science of victory. The elemental principle of victory. The elemental principles of victory. The elemental principle of victory. The elemental technology of victory. The elemental technologies of victory. The elemental technology of victory. The low elemental art of victory. The low elemental arts of victory. The low elemental art of victory. The low elemental science of victory. The low elemental sciences of victory. The low elemental science of victory. The low elemental principle of victory. The low elemental principles of victory. The low elemental principle of victory. The low elemental technology of victory. The low elemental technologies of victory. The low elemental technology of victory. The high elemental art of victory. The high elemental arts of victory. The high elemental art of victory. The high elemental science of victory. The high elemental sciences of victory. The high elemental science of victory. The high elemental principle of victory. The high elemental principles of victory. The high elemental principle of victory. The high elemental technology of victory. The high elemental technologies of victory. The high elemental technology of victory. The agent of victory. The agents of victory. The agent of victory. The agency of victory. The agencies of victory. The agency of victory. The amplifier of victory. The amplifiers of victory. The amplifier of victory. The amplification of victory. The amplifications of victory. The amplification of victory. The enhancer of victory. The enhancers of victory. The enhancer of victory. The enhancement of victory. The enhancements of victory. The enhancement of victory. The magnifier of victory. The magnifiers of victory. The magnifier of victory. The magnification of victory. The magnifications of victory. The magnification of victory. The influencer of victory. The influencers of victory. The influencer of victory. The influence of victory. The influences of victory. The influence of victory. The emanator of victory. The emanators of victory. The emanator of victory. The emanation of victory. The emanations of victory. The emanation of victory. The converger of victory. The convergers of victory. The converger of victory. The convergence of victory. The convergences of victory. The convergence of victory. The aura of victory. The auras of victory. The aura of victory. The impression of victory. The impressions of victory. The impression of victory. The intelligence of victory. The intelligences of victory. The intelligence of victory. The sophistication of victory. The sophistications of victory. The sophistication of victory. The genius of victory. The geniuses of victory. The genius of victory. The polymath of victory. The polymaths of victory. The polymath of victory. The psychic of victory. The psychics of victory. The psychic of victory. The knowledge of victory. The knowledges of victory. The knowledge of victory. The understanding of victory. the understandings of victory, the understanding of victory, the wisdom of victory, the wisdoms of victory, the wisdom of victory, the secret of victory, the secrets of victory, the secret of victory, the mystery of victory, the mysteries of victory, the mystery of victory, the revelation of victory, the revelations of victory, the revelation of victory, the tactic of victory, the tactics of victory, the tactic of victory, the strategy of victory, the strategies of victory, the strategy of victory, the strength of victory, the strengths of victory, the strength of victory, the might of victory, the mights of victory, the might of victory, the power of victory, the powers of victory, the power of victory, the authority of victory, the authorities of victory, the authority of victory, the dominion of victory, the dominions of victory, the dominion of victory, the rhythm of victory, the rhythms of victory, the rhythm of victory, the melody of victory, the melodies of victory, the melody of victory, the music of victory, the musics of victory, the music of victory, the lyric of victory, the lyrics of victory, the lyric of victory, the song of victory, the songs of victory, the song of victory, the dance of victory, the dances of victory, the dance of victory, the spirit of victory, the spirits of victory, the spirit of victory, the soul of victory, the souls of victory, the soul of victory, the body of victory, the bodies of victory, the body of victory, the mark of victory, the marks of victory, the mark of victory, the promise of victory, the promises of victory, the promise of victory, the visionary of victory, the visionaries of victory, the visionary of victory, the vision of victory, the visions of victory, the vision of victory, the picture of victory, the pictures of victory, the picture of victory, the sound of victory, the sounds of victory, the sound of victory, the tongue of victory, the tongues of victory, the tongue of victory, the language of victory, the languages of victory, the language of victory, the communication of victory, the communications of victory, the communication of victory, the people of victory, the peoples of victory, the people of victory, the society of victory, the societies of victory, the society of victory, the fortress of victory, the fortresses of victory, the fortress of victory, the government of victory, the governments of victory, the government of victory, the city of victory, the cities of victory, the city of victory, the nation of victory, the nations of victory, the nation of victory, the civilization of victory, the civilizations of victory, the civilization of victory, the world of victory, the worlds of victory, the world of victory,